Joining me today over coffee at the Office Cafe in Brussels, Canadian Ambassador Dan Costello. We talk about CETA, results and how it's all going, and also how Europe and Canada can work together for global challenges. Ambassador Dan Costello, thanks for joining us over a coffee today. I don't think Europe exports coffee to Canada, but other exports from CETA are going pretty well right now. What's your perception of the general relationship?
Thanks for having me and thanks for the coffee.
You're welcome.
The relationship is great and CETA is going really well. It's interesting how Canada and the EU have really come together in recent years. I've been here for 3.5 years, a little over 3.5 years now, and CETA is sort of a crowning moment, but we've got so much else going on. We've really become indispensable partners in supporting the rules-based international order, and we see CETA as a great expression of our commitment to rules-based trade and to supporting the kinds of values we'd like to see more widely used out there.
Given that some of those values and the rules-based order is under a little pressure, not least from one of your neighbours, do you think that CETA represents an example of what can be achieved and why we should focus more on that kind of system?
Absolutely. No, CETA, we went into CETA very much with the idea that this would be a model. This would be something that would not only be about trade, inclusive trade, we say, for shared prosperity, but also trade that would take into account the core values that we wanted to bring into our trade agreements, which mean that trade that will not be pursued at the extent of lowering standards or our commitment to a strong role for governments in upholding quality public services in key areas that matter to our citizens: public health, environment, labor.
You've had a little bit of time to evaluate how it's going, and the sense that many of CETA's opponents presented was that the standards, as you say, would risk being lowered. Has that happened?
No, absolutely not. In fact, we made explicit commitments in CETA that we would maintain high standards and work together to try and raise them wherever we could, and that we absolutely would not. That was an innovation, something really important to our critics and I think to our own citizens at home across the board who wanted to see that trade and investment, open trade, rules-based trade would nonetheless not be pursued in any way that could undermine the standards that we cherish. And that's where I think like-minded partners can come together to set these kinds of standards, because we know, not least from engaging our critics, as we did in the long road to getting there, that the more we listen to them, the more we realize, you know what, they're coming from a place that's real here. We share their values, we share their concerns. Why not put that explicitly in the agreement? So I'm really happy to say that here we are 1.5 years in on entry into force, a provisional application, but most of the deal. The numbers are great, and the fears have not been realized, as we knew they wouldn't, because we built in those protections and those commitments. And in fact, CETA has instead become a platform for really close cooperation in a whole bunch of areas beyond the Canada-EU relationship, and I think that's a great thing. Well, we've made commitments recently on CETA and gender, and how to bring gender-based analysis and gender disaggregated data into our trade policy and into our other trade agreements. We've made commitments on how we can do better for SMEs, because we can't really talk about inclusive trade that benefits our citizens if we're leaving out small businesses, which represent the largest part of our economies. And we've made commitments on climate action, because we want to demonstrate through CETA that trade is part of the solution. We've got to get serious about climate action. Our kids are going to make sure we do. It's not only that CETA will help us to maintain high commitments, but that will help us to develop the kinds of uses of trade to replace, for example, higher carbon emissions with low carbon imports, or to promote the kinds of investment that we know is going to be needed to bring new technologies to scale that are going to help us to meet the climate challenge, which is about more than just, obviously we have to reduce our emissions, we have to move to that low and no carbon future as quickly as possible, but we also have to maintain economic growth, because we know that there's a lot of people that are saying, hey, we're having trouble making ends meet.
Within the context of CETA as it stands today, do you see all the infrastructure there, all the framework there to achieve what you've just described, or do you think that the Paris Agreement, for example, should be bound in with CETA 2.0? CETA
was negotiated and completed before Paris, but in our first joint ministerial committee, which is part of the CETA governance. CETA has elaborate, transparent governance, which we're very proud of. 20 governance tables go along with it that lead to this annual ministerial table where we reconfirmed our commitment to the Paris Agreement and to showing progress on it and to facilitating as much as possible environmental technologies and investments through the use of CETA that will help us to get there. Has it done everything? Of course not. I mean, we can always do better. My Prime Minister likes to say so.
What would your Prime Minister like to see done better sooner?
Generally, what he tells us when we meet him as a group of ambassadors is you got to talk to your critics. You don't have to agree with them, and Lord knows I don't always, but you have to learn from them, he says, because they're coming from a real place.
How do you engage with them?
During the CETA process, certainly up to ratification at the European level, I said I'll meet anybody, anywhere, anytime. And particularly when it came to the parliamentarians who wanted to direct various stakeholders to me. And there were times when I have to acknowledge, if someone is opposed to trade, I don't know what to say. But that's very rare. Most of the time, almost all the time, when I spoke to critics and they said to me, well, I'm concerned about labor standards. I'm concerned about environmental protection. I'm concerned about food safety. I say, well, so am I. The whole idea of negotiating with a like-minded partner who shares not just your core values, but your social model and your international commitments, there's a real opportunity to establish a model that we can try and bring through the lessons learned in CETA. We can bring it to other trade tables.
Is at risk, not just globally, but within Europe, given that the rise of populism, we see more and more populist governments across Europe as well. Are you comfortable with the direction that Europe is going in general and that you can see Europe as a stable partner for the future?
Absolutely. Look, what we observe, and we have it at home too, is there's a lot of anxiety out there. There's a lot of concern. And when I talk to people in the CETA approval process, it came back to the pace of change. Like, things are moving so quickly. And frankly, I think that's technology more than it is trade liberalization. But the impacts are real, and they're there, and it's led to a real concern for economic security, job security, border security, and this so-called crisis of confidence in our institutions.
Well, how do you address that at home in Canada?
I'm not a politician. I'm a public servant and a diplomat. But I like this adage that says that all politics is about hope and fear. And fear we have to take seriously. It's real. But the way to turn it into hope is to hear it out and to acknowledge shared concerns and to recognize that they're usually coming from a shared set of values that we can say, hey, you know what, you're right. What can we do about it? And in fact, look what we're already doing about it. And I think in CETA we were able to do that successfully. And I don't think we won everybody over, but I think with time, I've always said time is our friend because we're putting up really good numbers, which should mean if we're tracking it and breaking it down by region, by sector, to make sure this is shared prosperity, we're going to see success there, but we're not going to see a compromising of our commitments to core values and to a strong role for the state in regulating the economy, which is what we believe in.
Prime Minister Trudeau has been involved a lot in the disinformation fight back, I guess. Yeah. The sense that the good numbers should be enough to convince critics, that approach wouldn't seem to have a lot of mileage left in it. So how do you deal with...
Don't give up on facts. Facts are important. We have to stand by facts. But you're right, disinformation is a serious issue. We made it one of the key priorities of our G7 presidency. It's been taken up as well by the French, and I know it's moving into wider circles. This is something we have to get together on. I think it's fair to say that, as with so many of our citizens' concerns, the state hasn't kept up with the pace of change. And so we have to look hard at this in terms of what is the role of the state in regulating in the public interest to make sure that as new technologies come online, like we couldn't have anticipated all the impacts of social media, but as we look ahead to AI, as we look ahead to digitization across the economy, to quantum, to all of these new areas, we've got to do better at anticipating impacts. It's going to mean a lot for the job market. It's going to mean a lot for democracy.
We're looking not just at disinformation, but the impact of states, particularly Russia, and trying to influence European elections, American elections, Canadian elections as well. Do you feel the pressure from Russia?
Absolutely, we've felt the pressure, and this has been stated publicly, and I think we're getting better, both public, private, civil society groups at tracking this.
Is it just tracking, or do you have pushback?
And calling it out through various means of demonstrating, does this sound reasonable, that so many bots, so many trolls jumping into so many debates and polarizing. I I think there's a real disruptive force there. Now, we know social media can also enliven and invigorate democracy and can be beneficial too, so I'm not dismissive of this. I'm just saying that we've learned, I think, as the first generation living with this, that we've got to get ahead. We've got to be vigilant.
And the argument is that disinformation is not designed to change your mind necessarily, but to cause such dissatisfaction with institutions, to cause people not to believe in anything rather than to believe in something. I
think that's right.
How do you push back against that in Canada? And your European partners are part of this global challenge as well?
Well, I think we need citizens to know they can have confidence in their public authorities when it comes to establishment of facts, like the regulator and the scientific basis of regulations, the evidentiary basis. So that's something that I think the integrity of our institutions is fundamental, and that's where rule of law and the liberal democratic fundamentals, they have to be transparent, we have to be accountable, we have to be prepared to engage our critics at all times. Part of our the exercise of our sovereignty and the nature of our governance in all of its innovative and asymmetrical forms has been about dialogue.
NATO's not essentially about dialogue, and I know you're not the ambassador to NATO, but Canada's participation with Europe in NATO, has it become more important during the Trump presidency, where the very existence of NATO has been called into question at times?
It's always been fundamentally important. I mean, it's funny, when I think of, people often ask me, well, why did you do CETA? I try and say Canadians feel very much of Europe and part of Europe. We always have been, from those early European settlers to the waves of European immigrants who came to Canada and built our country and gave us our institutions and our culture and our social model. Canadians have been coming back to Europe, certainly through our war experience, where there's so many sacrificed, so many soldiers were lost here, and then in the post-war construction of not just the European project, but the rules-based international order, of which it's a pillar. NATO was always a fundamental part of that. That fundamental security guarantee permitted the construction of this project, and we've been very proud to be part of it. It's the most successful military alliance in history, and I think it's something that, yeah, we can have a vigorous debate about the various priorities within NATO and the various allocation of budgets. Sometimes it feels far when you're in Canada, but recalling how close we are and how much family we have in Europe and how many of us descend from Europe, European defense, transatlantic defense is something that I think is baked into our political and security culture. It's about collective defense in the end. It's the fact that we stand together, and that's we always have through our wartime experience to the present.
When you look at rules-based societies, not just in trade at the moment, does Europe play a role in Canada? Does the European...
Absolutely.
What I mean is that does the European voice resonate in Canada as one of authority, or is it one that's listened to just as a matter of consideration?
Canadians understand that the European project has had its twists and turns, and vive le débat, as we say. We're pretty good at our own innovative forms of asymmetrical governance, and so I think we get this. But if you look around the world right now, who's standing up? Look at our fundamental interests in security. When it comes to higher up security value chains, conflict prevention, post-conflict stabilization, all the governance work, police training, election observation, we do that together with the EU. Same thing on prosperity. If I look at economic rulemaking, the EU is still a key regulator, and when we can come together and build broader coalitions, especially on things like new technologies, and then when it comes to core values, who's defending human rights globally right now? Well, who's speaking up for multilateral
action? Does it surprise
action?
you that when Prime Minister Trudeau came to Strasbourg and was received as something of a rock star, it wasn't just that a lot of our MEPs in particular find this a handsome Prime Minister coming for selfies, but they identify with someone who was articulating what they wanted to see within the European framework, someone who was giving a positive message on migration when many of our leaders here were failing on that as well. Is there a greater role for Canada within the European framework in this sense?
Well, you may know that we established, along with Sita, a parallel strategic partnership agreement where we have a vigorous dialogue going on at countless tables on all kinds of issues, like climate action, like migration, like macroeconomic forecasting, and like development coordination. And this is a really, I've always thought that a really mature, good relationship is less about each other and about how we can work together to support other places in the world.
What can Canada do on migration?
Well, we can speak to our experience. I would never tell Europeans what they should do, because Lord knows we have a very different history, a very different geography, and we haven't been through the kind of crisis that happened here. But we do have a certain experience when it comes to integrated border management and also immigration selection and screening and integration at home to get these new arrivals to work and to become active members of our society. We're very proud of that experience, and if there are lessons in there for some Europeans that want to look at it, then we're always open to that.
Just to conclude, what would your advice be to the new European Parliament, to the new Commission?
Well, no, I don't think that would be diplomatic to answer directly, because I'll keep saying what I've been saying for several years, which is, Europe, you're not in this alone. We're in this together. And so remember that even though you've got complex internal issues to sort out, you're part of a like-minded community of values where Canada and your other partners around the world are counting on you. We're counting on you to get through your internal issues and to be able to look outward with us to address these global issues that we've got to bring others into together. And so I think that's the perspective, the broader perspective on looking at this. And look, I know they're tough local issues, but I think whenever we can broaden that perspective and realize that we've got friends, we've got allies who share our values and our objectives and our aspirations and are prepared to articulate them, I think that matters a lot.
Ambassador Dan Costello, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the coffee.